It's like New York, guys. So good, we brad twice.
We did it twice. We did it twice.
Greetings and salutations. Of course, we are live with the amazing Celeste Conowitch. And today we are talking about what makes epic fantasy epic.
One
We
of
are
my
not live soon.
favorites.
We are live now with game designer and fantasy savant Celeste Conowitch. Celeste, how you doing?
I'm doing great. So happy to be back and chatting with you all about one of my favorite things, epic fantasy.
Oh man, yeah, I knew when this topic came up, I had to get Celeste out to come and
Yes.
talk to you about it. Let me tell you a little bit about Celeste for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of listening to her before. Celeste is a game designer based out of Seattle. She's the producer, GM, and editor of the actual play podcast venture Maidens. And when not plotting behind the screen, she works as a senior game designer at Kobold Press, currently leading the Tales of the Valiant RPG project, which we're going to be talking about more later because, epic fantasy. Keep up with Celeste. Follow her on Twitter at C Conowitch. Or if you feel like it, you could go and check out. Yes, Secondhand Samurai has already done the thing. You can go and check out Celeste's latest work on the Tales of the Valiant. It is live on Kickstarter right now. Go follow that link, check it out. It is spectacular, and we'll be talking more about exactly what it is later. Spoiler alert, it's epic.
It's epic fantasy, in fact, one might say.
Hella epic. So that's what you can expect. Let's dive straight in because I feel like we're gonna have a lot to say about this topic, and I'm very, very excited. Epic fantasy. All right. So if you had to pitch it in like a brief, if you had to give an elevator pitch of epic fantasy, what would you say it is?
Sure. So epic fantasy is one aspect of the fantasy genre that really focuses on large scale events that start with small or small heroes, right? Who rise to meet very large struggles, I think is probably the core tenet of fantasy. And I might shove somewhere in there too, all about the struggle between good and evil. I might probably shove that in there as like a key aspect we really want to hit on when we talk about epic fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. And those really are, we're going to go more into detail about, what it is, really unpacking the genre. But I think, yeah, in a nutshell, it is a big old epic struggle. Large is definitely a word we should
Large
be using.
scale,
And
yes.
again, good and evil, this kind of like world-sized conflicts is definitely what we're talking about here. So let's take it back to the origins of epic fantasy because it's always interesting to think about where something came from. Uh, Actually, the reason we use epic in epic fantasy comes from the epic poem. Celeste, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So I mean, we've been seeing epic fantasy stories like all the way since, pretty much like very near the dawn of human civilization when we're getting these like epic tales about characters like Beowulf is probably the biggest example of this. But, epic storytelling has been around in human culture for a very, very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Technically, an epic is, and I quote, a long narrative poem in elevated style recounting the deeds of a legendary or historical figure, specifically a hero. Now, when we say historical, generally one of the buy-ins of epic fantasy is that gods walk the earth, myths are real, there is magic, there are witches and sorcerers. And so when we're talking history, we're very much seeing this through a magical lens. This is already a space that is fantastical.
Yeah. Larger than life goes far beyond what people on Earth would know, and taking heroes and elevating to these statuses that, yeah, they're making deals with gods. When you talk about like Greek mythology or even Egyptian mythology, like making deals with gods, working with them, and then also confronting monsters that normal people would never have, come to terms with in their day-to-day life.
Absolutely. The Odyssey is a great example.
Yes.
There is a guy who is, I believe, a descendant of a god, and he goes. He basically it's the Odyssey would have been a lot shorter with sat nav. He gets lost
Right. With
in
the
the
GPS, he would
Mediterranean
have gotten
Sea.
there so fast.
Oh my goodness. It'd be this long. It would not be an epic. It would be a
No.
limerick.
Yeah, or we're talking about like Gilgamesh and like all there are lots of precedents for the origins of this kind of storytelling,
Absolutely.
and clearly a lot of that led into the modern epic fantasy we see today.
Absolutely. The Odyssey, I was going to say, is just a great example of that because, you have the Cyclops, you have witches, and this is an historical hero who is
Right.
clearly, interacting with the son of Poseidon frequently. This is not history. This is fantasy.
Yep.
Um, and then this kind of storytelling died out to a certain extent, and it lives on in fairy tales and folk myths and these kinds of things, but it leaves the literary space until you start to see writers like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis who are interested. There's this rejuvenation, this resurgence of interest in the 19th century and the 20th century in folk tales, in essentially fantasy, and understanding where these things come from. And then you start to see, everybody says Tolkien is the father of fantasy, but he was pulling from Beowulf. He was
Oh
pulling
yeah.
from the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which are these sort of Viking texts. Again, the stories like Beowulf, these big Viking sagas, all being pulled on to create what we think of today as epic fantasy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what's really interesting, I mean, epic fantasy too, like, we seem to have started with epic fantasy, and then our fantasy did get a little bit more localized and
Yeah,
more, about cautionary fairy tales, right? That were
yeah,
really stories to help people deal with their world around them. And then when travel started, like people started traveling to other continents, and we're seeing, globalization start to happen. That was
yeah,
like really when epic fantasy started to like creep back into society, like because the world just got so much bigger for a
yeah,
lot of people.
yeah,
So it's really
absolutely.
interesting seeing how that ebbed and flowed throughout human history.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, in that period, you see things like the Tales of Jonathan Swift,
Yes.
Gulliver's Travels, these kinds of things where, the focus it's fantastical, but the focus is much more on voyage and return because that was so much what was going on. So I don't mean to give you a history lesson, but the reason I bring this up is that it's so important to understand where the origins of this thing are, because what we are doing is reinterpreting source material through writer after writer after writer, right? Like the lineage of Tolkien is the lineage of the Viking Edda, it's the lineage of the Odyssey. This is the lineage. So sometimes understanding where things come from gives us a clear understanding of what we're examining, but also re-examining the roots can give us new interpretations and new ways of approaching a topic, which is why I bring up the origins in the first place.
It also just helps us too. I mean, having more, it's never a bad thing to look at source material, right? And if you are interested in designing, writing epic fantasy, obviously hitting those classics and, seeing the different waves of them is always helpful to making your experience easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually leads me very nicely onto my next question, which is classic or important examples of epic fantasy. That's books, games, movies. Folks in the chat, I want to hear your opinions. What has been
Yeah.
important to you in terms of epic fantasy? What's been formative for you? What are your favorite things? And I guess the same question to Celeste. Like, what is important for you when we talk about epic fantasy?
Yeah, well, in talking in terms of like specific examples, it has been really great to be here in this space as a lover of epic fantasy. Like at our moment in time, we are getting some really interesting new book series, new video games, new novels. I feel like epic fantasy is almost having a resurgence in
Yeah,
a lot of
absolutely.
ways. So obviously, you look at something like we all know Lord of the Rings is probably like the modern standard or like set the tone for epic fantasy these days. But that even itself has changed a lot. A
Absolutely.
lot
Yeah.
of the practices that Tolkien employed in his stories now don't work quite as well for like a modern audience here. And the big steps we kind of saw is like Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and then we in like 70s, 80s when fantasy like really just blew up and we started getting things like the Dragonlance series or like Wheel of Time. Like these are probably big like cultural touchstones that most people now are starting to learn about and see
Or
again. We're seeing Wheel of
rediscover.
Time
Yeah.
pop up again like as a video series. And we're seeing, Dragonlance get a resurgence in D&D 5th edition. Um, and then but even now we're seeing some great new epic fantasy, like the 5th season series, like by N.K. Jemisin, is a fantastic example of like modern epic storytelling that is just so cool. Or like the Mistborn series, Brandon Sanderson. Like there are so many that I feel like those are some of the ones that for me are like clear touchstones that come to my mind.
Yeah.
But what about you? I'm always looking for recommendations, so I'm
Oh
like,
my goodness. Kaya-tan says Chronicles of Narnia is what pushed me to start writing.
oh yeah,
That definitely has epic elements. We're going to talk
yeah,
more about, epic fantasy and really, really what defines epic fantasy, but definitely epic elements in the Chronicles of Narnia. Big conflict, big struggle between good and evil there. Secondhand Samurai says Lucian of Samosota, a true story, is the epic bloke down the pub tale.
cool.
Interesting. We've got from Hero Shepherd Aragon, Legend of Zelda.
Yes, Tears of the Kingdom, totally an
Yes.
epic, y'all. And I've been playing it a bunch too, so friend of mine for sure.
Dragon Riders of Pern is another one. Again, epic elements in that, absolutely.
Yeah.
Shannara Chronicles, classic example of, good versus evil in sort of giant continent-sized
Yeah,
struggle, right?
right.
Game of Thrones is a very good example. The
There we go.
TV series Game of Thrones, I think, is one of the things that really kicked off or really spurred on this like current interest that we have in fantasy. And we'll talk more about high fantasy versus epic fantasy and why they might be different. But for me, Game of Thrones is such a perfect example of that, of how you don't have to have magic in everybody's hands. You
Right.
don't have to have a hugely magical universe. You can
Mhm.
have a world that is really a lot like our world with some magical elements, and it can still be epic as
Yeah.
foo.
Yes.
And whatever mistakes were made in Lord of the Rings, and we will talk about that. Oh, we will talk about
We
that.
will talk about them.
It's big, right? It
Yes.
gives you that big, expansive, epic feeling. I think it's a really, really wonderful touchstone for modern writers who are getting into epic fantasy now to really go, okay, that is epic fantasy.
Yeah, setting a standard for sure.
Yeah. Lots of shout outs here for Pern and Shannara. Tears of the Kingdom from Laria Enel. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And again, these are all things that have that sort of epic feel to them, that big space. Yeah, I mean, Brandon Sanderson for me, Elantris, which is Brandon Sanderson's first book, was absolutely mind-blowing in terms of understanding how a standalone novel, which is not a lot of space,
Right.
can be really epic. For me, that was a beautiful micro epic fantasy, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but he really delivered on the epicness
Yeah.
within a single book without this sort of big overarching plot that took 3 novels and 17 trees and everything else.
Yeah.
I'm not always a massive fan of Sanderson. I can take it or leave it, and some Sanderson for me is better than others, but yes, absolutely. Interestingly, someone has raised The Expanse, which I think is a wonderful example of the epic,
Yeah.
right? That's
Well,
the
like,
epic side of it.
and there's like Star Wars, like absolutely,
Exactly.
or like something like the Locked Tomb series. So like Gideon the Ninth, like that's epic. But yeah, definitely going into the sci-fi or the science fantasy side of
Yeah.
things. So sci-fi has been doing a lot for the epic genre as well,
Yeah.
certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that sort of epic tag.
Yeah.
The Belgeriad series was a big 80s hit, and I think for me, if we're talking about older versions, the term high fantasy was first coined by Lloyd Alexander, who wrote the Prydain series.
Oh yeah. Okay.
In 1971, I think he coined that term. And for me, that is really that's epic, right? Like that is there's it's a battle for good and evil, and there's fairies, and there's a pot that boils people, and it's yeah.
Okay, I have to read that.
The
That
books
sounds
of my
fantastic.
childhood, really, really good, really strong. And again, one of like got in on the ground floor to Lloyd Alexander, really, setting the tone for a lot of
Yeah.
what came after. I think now is a really good time to talk about the defining characteristics of epic fantasy, because a lot of things that have been thrown out are, like Mass Effect and Expanse, and they're obviously not fantasy, or at least not pure fantasy. So, what would you say are the defining characteristics of epic fantasy? What must there be? or what should there not be in order for it to be considered epic fantasy?
Yeah, I think one of the big things you have to consider is the characters and the way they grow. Because almost every example of epic fantasy starts with we have at least one or a group of main characters who do not have the resources they need to
Yeah.
fight whatever the huge, massive evil or problem is. So these stories are usually about these very common or like basic characters that
Mm.
have to grow and change and learn what they need to overcome this thing. And so the story is always about their evolution and how they can eventually fight or, conquer whatever this is. So I would say your characters that start small in scale and then be able to fight this larger thing. And we've referenced as well to this, like, whatever this larger thing or evil is, this is a key element of epic fantasy. You
Absolutely.
need to have that villain, that all powerful evil force that is not only just antagonizing, the character, but they're threatening many people or something on a larger scale, whether this is an entire continent or the whole world. Like, you have to have that evil and unquestioningly evil force too.
Yeah.
Is a big important thing about villains and like challenges in epic fantasy. So those are the two that really come to mind for me. The
Yeah.
third, the kind of the soft one, is you have to basically, yeah, zoom out the camera on like the amount of locations or people or conflict that you have. Like, epic fantasy, you can't have it all set in the same town, right? In the same city. You travel to different places. You see how this evil affects multiple people, multiple factions. And that's a key part of storytelling, the traveling and the exploration of this larger world and seeing how the conflict affects different places.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting that you touched on those areas. I think for me that epic thing, one of the key factors is scope. It's
Yeah,
the
scope.
active world building area starts big, right?
Yes.
Like again, let's go back to Game of Thrones as an example because a lot of people have seen the TV series, even if they haven't read the books. It's quite universal. The first book starts in Westeros,
Yeah.
but it doesn't start in a town in Westeros. It starts in the whole of Westeros,
Yeah.
right? And there's stuff going on at the north, and there's stuff going on at the south,
Yeah.
and there's lots of different locations. And that's something that's really critical. It's a large active world building area. As you said, that necessitates travel, that necessitates long distance communication. Um, but that large scope is important. And so usually you're talking about no less than a country or a region. Very rarely, I can't think of an example as small as a city. It
No, I
would not
can't.
be
Yeah.
considered epic fantasy at that
Mm-mm.
point. And world level or continent level is very, very common.
Or
So
even
you might,
universe level if you're
or
talking into
even
sci-fi,
universe level.
right?
Absolutely. Although, again, that would be more towards the
Yeah,
space
the
opera space or
sci-fi
the
space
superhero
opera.
space. That would be away from like the epic
Yeah.
fantasy genre itself. Um, so yeah, that's one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is that often you are dealing with different nations.
Yeah.
Often you are dealing with the heads of different nations. So you'll be dealing with royalty, you'll be dealing with lords and ladies,
Yeah.
you'll get into that aristocracy space. So then you're dealing with like different echelons of society, and that's necessary because of the scope of this thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Because you can't have something like a huge threat that's really threatening everyone without talking about how is it affecting different levels of society. You need to see that, like, how is the commoner populace being affected by this? How is the high level, like, the higher status figures being affected? Because
Yeah.
whatever this evil is, it needs to affect everyone. That's what makes it so frightening.
Absolutely. And that can introduce challenges because it seems like a lot of world building. Uh,
Yes.
so
Yes.
I would say don't be frightened. It's okay. Uh, we'll talk about mistakes in a minute, but don't feel like you have to build out everything. You can spotlight what needs to be built to make sure you're not, getting sucked into the, oh my God, I must build everything from the ground
Everything
up,
at
all the
once.
things. Remember your meta, remember the agile world building techniques that will stop you having to,
Yes.
do everything.
And remember, your characters start knowing very little as well. So share information as they learn information is a very nice way to focus
Yeah.
your epic fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. Using the character as the audience surrogate is a really strong way of doing that.
Yes.
I think for me, you mentioned already stakes. They should be high.
High, very high.
Tumpkins has not lost his toy. That is not what we're looking for in an epic fantasy novel.
No, no.
Unless Tumpkins is a god and his toy is the key to the universe,
Is,
that is not the plot
gravity.
we're looking at here.
Yeah.
No. We are talking powerful sorcerers. We are talking epic stakes. We are talking life and death, good versus evil, the tarnishing of a million souls.
Yeah.
So you should be thinking big, as Celeste said, both in the impact of the evil and in the power of the evil.
The
And
challenges
that's
that must be faced. Yeah.
absolutely, and that's something that again feeds into that, the characters are growing stronger. There will be teething troubles, but you should be seeing an escalation throughout the series because we are looking at a big powerful evil, and there's a growth that needs to happen in order for our characters to overcome that. If they're already ready at the beginning of the book, they're
What's
just
the
getting an
story?
Uber to the
Yeah. To
villain's
the big
lair
bad and be like, all right, guys, cool, another one to fight.
yeah,
It
exactly.
has to start off as something that seems insurmountable.
Yeah.
Whatever the level of your character should be proportionate to that. And then the story is all about how we climb that mountain.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that's some of my big ones. We've talked about themes. The themes should be something that is, again, good and evil is a very common one. There are other themes you can use. Life versus death is another theme. Often that gets like toned into.
It couldn't, yeah, evil. It's all, if we all die, it's on the evil side. It's whatever that moral struggle is. There's a very clear one side and there's a very clear other side that guides kind of the principle of your story.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you get more into moral grays, ask yourself whether you might be doing sword and sorcery.
Yeah, you might be drifting into a different type of fantasy in a lot of those instances.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the big misunderstandings about epic fantasy, and this comes from it's like teething, like as I said, Lloyd Alexander talks about the term high fantasy. Epic fantasy does not have to be everybody is a magic user. It does not have to be a high magic world. It is usually a second world fantasy. That is not always the case. Sometimes the second world is very similar to our world, like Game of Thrones or Elantris. There's a lot of stuff that's similar. There are a few key things like her magic that is different, right? And I would say that it does not have to be, and this is another misconception, it does not have to be a medieval fantasy world.
No, absolutely not.
You can play with different areas of technology. You can really experiment there. Do not feel like you have to make another medieval fantasy world in order for it to be epic fantasy. There are a lot of different ways that the epicness and the fantasyness can be expressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes, I mean, that's something that makes epic fantasy really powerful, is like magic is one of those resources that perhaps the villain or the big bad has, and they are ruining the lives of those who do not have it. So often in epic fantasy, we see characters who have zero magic, no magic whatsoever, and then gaining access to a magic that can fight the magic of the villain is a very common thing to see. So don't be afraid of like starting off. You have, level 1 commoner guy. I'm like, I'm a peasant. I'm a farmer, I'm a hobbit. I just like my garden. What? Yeah. And then we even see it like Lord of the Rings. I mean, the hobbits don't actually get any magical powers. Their magical power is we love the world, right?
Yeah, their magical power is magical resilience, and that's
magical
it. That's
friendship.
all they've got.
Like that's what they got,
Yeah.
So magic can absolutely factor in, and oftentimes it does. But that's certainly not, you don't need every sword and sorcery trope in the book to make epic fantasy work.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, let's talk tropes of epic fantasy. I'm going to start us off with one that you brought up, travel.
Yes.
The world is big. We got places to go.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have spaceships because it's fantasy.
Yep.
Uber hasn't been invented. Travel.
Yes. Travel. Oh man, there are so many interesting ways to play with this, but I feel like because epic fantasy is all about, here we go, we're starting here, and then there's this gargantuan problem we have to solve at the very end. And then along the way, we have a series of other problems we need to overcome to be able to deal with this big one. And I think travel is one of the great classic problems we have. Like, oh no, the big bad evil is in this fortress that nobody can get around. How do we get through this, right? So we have to figure out a way to magically travel. We have to get an item that will get us in there. But, you know, this item is hidden in the mountains of Shalala from, you know, 1,000 years ago. So seeing those, getting to these places is such a great way to establish those micro problems, right, that you have to address to the very end.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite RPGs that I have not had enough time to dig into is Cubicle 7's Adventures in Middle-earth.
Oh, yeah.
And the travel is lethal, guys. Like, there's a
Yes.
whole section of how you travel and what happens and the encounters that you have along the way. And these are played in semi-downtime and semi-real time. It's super interesting the way they put it together as an RPG.
Cool.
That you can't do in a novel, for example. I mean, you can
Right.
summarize and do present.
Yeah, but you can't talk about
present
camping
prose.
too much, right?
Yeah,
in the novel,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that would be the kind of writer's example, writer's cognate there. But the way that they've introduced travel, and by the end of the travel, you can either be at an advantage or at a disadvantage.
I like that. I like that
It
a
is
lot.
so clever. You can easily use that in any kind of epic fantasy storytelling medium, that either you arrive refreshed and you know, with extra weapons at your side, or you arrive exhausted and morally broken before you even begin the epic adventure. It sets so
Right.
much tone to me.
I mean, that's that great. I mean, the Lord of the Rings example, you know, like traveling so hard to reach, you know, Rohan, and like, oh, we need them as an ally. And we're like, get there, HUD, you get there. And then there's a whole mess and they don't want to talk to you and they don't want to be your friends. They've got worm tongue problems, right? That's like a perfect example of how that could work, right? You know, you show, if you got that disadvantage on travel, you show up, that's what you get worm tongue there when you're ready. But you know, if you have the advantage, maybe it's fine. They're like, oh wow, you walked all this way, love it, totally gonna be friends.
I want a t-shirt that says I have worm tongue problems.
I have worm tongue problems.
Nobody would understand, but
there's a lot of ways that could go with no
yeah,
context.
that could go very wrong. But yeah, Little Red Dot says worm tongue problems, don't we all?
Don't we
man, yeah, we do. So yeah, absolutely. And you know, you can really use travel in a very clever way. I'm not going to talk about the Eagles, but do make sure that do make sure your travel is necessary and there's not obviously an easier way. And if there is an easier way, explain why they're not taking it.
Yeah.
You know, make sure that you're not falling into that trap of just making them take the scenic route for reasons, because your players or your readers will be mad at you, and you don't need that.
And you don't need that. You don't need that in your life.
It's epic fantasy. There's still 4 books to go. You don't want them mad at you. Keep them on your side. Ooh, another one, dungeons. Big part of epic fantasy.
Yes, yes. Oh, what's so great about dungeons and epic fantasy is, and we'll probably talk about this when we talk about like things to avoid in epic fantasy. Like dungeons allow you to explore the history of a world, or like some of the causality of maybe this big bad, in a way that makes sense in the story, because you're actively going into them and you're exploring this, like, why is this very powerful thing, why wasn't this here when the evil showed up, right? And talking about that and like going through the dungeon is a great way to talk about that without just info dumping. Why, you know, at the beginning of the story. So dungeons are huge for those.
Yeah, they are, as you say, an amazing expositional tool for delivering a whole bunch of critical information in a way that's super active and has a lot of story involved to it, and a lot of character moments involved in it. Yeah, which actually brings me to my next point, which is a lot of history. Now, this is Tolkien's fault, and I'm going to blame Tolkien. But the reason that it's so effective in the epic fantasy genre is because when we're talking big, we're not just talking geography big.
Yeah.
We're not just talking power big. We're talking ancient. And it's that like a chunk of timeline is actually something that is very, very common trope of epic fantasy.
Oh yeah. I mean, and when you talk about especially the trope of like characters starting with like no power, no knowledge, this is a huge trope relied on. The character may not think they have a lot of power or like influence, but because they are the third generation born of an ancient, queen who had like control over the sun, right? Like that's the kind of history, like once that is revealed to the character, they're like, oh man. So understanding that and then like grasping that power from way back when, to be able and learning how to wield it to face the big ancient evil, right? That's a huge trope we see. I just thought of another Avatar, The Last Airbender, like
Yeah,
great example. Some epic that
yeah,
kind of like, ooh, born to this thing. I didn't necessarily know it, but then accessing it, like that's a huge and
absolutely.
very effective trope of epic fantasy.
The other great trope from history is the answers lie in the past. So
Yes,
you see the day of black sun in Avatar: The Last Airbender. You see,
right.
the secret way to defeat this villain was recorded in the ancient tomes. Actually,
Yeah.
this is something they use right at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. Is the only way that Gandalf could figure out what was going on, that the One Ring was back, was because the signs were recorded in ancient tomes in a language that nobody understood anymore, but Gandalf understood, so he could go and read it, and that was how he understood what was going on in the first place. Not just history, but knowledge lies in history, and power can lie in history. I
And
think big
also
tropes.
disaster can lie in history. Like a lot of the times, it's a very common trope for the big evil force or whatever it is, the big challenge to have occurred at some point in the past in this history. And these struggles are cyclical, right? So if it's every 1,000 years, the ancient dragon that's going to eat the world, rises up again. Like
Suddenly
that's
Ragnarok.
exactly, and we have to have that epic scale to understand or interact with the power that brings to the storytelling, right?
Yeah,
Those people who remember are usually a very key component of these stories, as well as the people who have forgotten, right? So
yeah,
that's the problem with like the age of men, and men forget, they have short memories, and that's a huge source of conflict in
yeah.
like Lord of the Rings, whereas the elves who've been around forever and like seen this before trying to warn people, like, so that's something that you can only achieve with that epic scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's also used as an in-world explanation for why Jack got powerful.
Yeah.
Jack got powerful because he hella old. He's
He's
old.
so old.
He has done this before.
He
He
has
has a
slept in a
playbook.
tomb for 1,000 years, just learning the secrets of, ancient sorcery, and then also being super mad. Like a
Yeah, just
1,000 years to get super mad.
liching up and polishing grudges,
Whoop, whoop,
basically.
whoop.
Yeah, that's on his Tinder profile. Uh,
Yeah. Lichen
Hobbies,
up.
liching up.
Looking for skeletons. Hit me up.
Yeah. Polishing grudges. Not a euphemism, people. So we talked a lot about history. Let's talk about battles. Big old battles.
Yes.
Again, Lord of the Rings, great example. Lots of chunky battles in there. Um, Game of Thrones. We're going to talk about common mistakes in a minute, and I'm going to bring up Game of Thrones. But Game of Thrones, lots of, again, big battles, many group cast events, big battle scenes with lots and lots and lots of unnamed characters, mooks, dare I say.
Mm, yeah. 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 It's
Um,
I
yeah.
mean, this is huge for it. And the part of the thing with epic fantasy, with travel, with history, a lot of these things come up because oftentimes what you need to defeat the big evil, big bad, is a lot of help. So
Yeah.
that's a huge trope. Like as the character is trying to master usually their personal power, they also have to work with others who to get like more large scale forces. So that's what makes, epic fantasy so exciting. As we see in that final battle, we're watching our characters and that personal story run congruently with those large scale, like, the armies of these seven kingdoms have now come together, and that parallel between that personal journey and the big journey is so critical.
Yeah. I think for me it's part of that like big thing as well. Like
Yeah.
it's not it's not a David and Goliath
Yeah.
where it's, there is a small character and a big character, which is by the way already kind of epic,
Yeah.
particularly if your character is literally a Goliath and super tall. Like that's another way to imbue that epic, that dial it up to 11. But having an army versus another army
Yeah.
is a great way to give it that big, to give it that
Scale.
epic, to give it that this is the world coming together to see the battle versus good and evil. And again, it's a superhero example, so it's not technically epic fantasy in its purest form, but the end of Endgame, Avengers Endgame, where you got all of the good guys versus all of the bad guys. Classic epic fantasy. If they were wearing wizard mages instead of like wizard robes instead of, you know,
like neon
Iron Man suits.
bodysuits, you know. Yeah, and that's the thing too, like going back to like your big bad at the end has to affect everyone. So if we're not seeing everyone in the world stand up to fight for what's right, then we're missing that key component of the epic scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Another major trope that you should not forget is the hero or the group of heroes. It is a heroic genre. We are focusing on either one or many people who are in some way heroic.
Yes. Yeah. And that's something too, like this is something big we're hammering on with Tales of the Valiant. Like we put it even right there in the name of this game Kobold Press is developing. Like we, from the get-go, our fantasy is going to be epic. Our fantasy is going to be heroic. Like it is going to be, you know, noble, bright. Like that is the vibe. Because even if characters, you know, stumble or come from these humble origins, right? You take your common petty thief at the beginning of the novel, they never stay that way. They rise to the occasion, right? They have to. The world demands it. They might be reticent at first, or you know, they might be reticent the whole way, but the thing is, in their heart, they are heroes, and we are seeing that come forth. It has to be that way. We can't murky our stories with like, ooh, they made a really evil choice or whatever. Like they're never willingly going down that path. There is always that call towards the heroic in them to do the right thing. That is so key to epic fantasy, because otherwise you're getting into dark fantasy, you're getting into grim dark, you know. If everything is too morally gray, especially on the side of the characters, you're wandering into different genres.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that there are hybrid genres. So dark epic fantasy is a thing. But when you're dealing with pure epic fantasy, generally it's fairly heroic, it's fairly noble. The characters by the end will have a high character agency. They will be able to change the world, and the world will be changed
by them,
if not forever, then for a good for now. Like it's not fixed forever maybe, but it's pretty solid. It's not here today, gone tomorrow. So yeah, absolutely, that feeling of heroic, that feeling of, you know, transformation. The characters almost become avatars of the hopes of the world, and often they struggle with that, which is also part of that story. You know, how can I, this small person, do this great thing?
Me, this guy from a village, like what? Even if I was born to this legacy, I've never known it. So the struggle with it is key to the storytelling, but in the end, they always make the right choice.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think the time has come. I've been alluding to it a whole bunch. Let's talk about common mistakes of epic fantasy.
Yes.
Oh, I've got some. I know you've got some.
Yeah.
I'm very eager to talk about this.
Yeah, go for it. You're so excited. You like start us off.
No.
I'm ready.
I just wanted to say there is no need to name names, and everybody receives things differently. So what might be a mistake for me might not be a mistake for you. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are technical mistakes, and some of the things I'm going to talk about are not their taste or their judgment or their, okay, it worked for this book, but it might not work in general. So I always put that out when I'm talking about mistakes as a caveat. Maybe you're writing the thing that breaks the rules. Maybe you're writing something that's interesting and new and different, and maybe it works for you in your thing. That's what I will say.
Or your audience, or your
story. Your audience. These are things that I have found have been problematic. I want you to start with the thing that you said about history, because I think that's so important.
Oh
we
boy,
talked a lot about how history is such a critical part of this genre, but
the history dump. So, and this is something that I feel like Tolkien is a little guilty of, and we started getting this bad habit. When we overload, we front end our audience with all of the history, because epic fantasy, like we said, demands history. It demands huge scale. but we have to start like another story. We have to start with the heroes. We have to start small, and we have to work out big. If we start, the chapter opener one, let me tell you the story of the 7 sons of Sugarath and the 700 years they reigned, and this name and that child and this war and all of this, and it's 20 pages of this history of a place we have to understand before we're even looking at the place or dropped into the place. Your audience isn't going to stick with you, especially modern audiences who have a lot less patience than people did before. Like, so overloading, just like spelling out all this history you don't need in the moment is like one of the biggest mistakes I see of epic fantasy.
Yeah, I have a whole seminar about exposition in world building and how to deliver it well and the common mistakes. And expo dumping is one of the biggest mistakes.
Yes.
Prologues are particularly at fault for this in novels,
Yes.
and this is because there was a tradition of the prologue, particularly in the 80s, the tradition that you set up the world in the prologue to invite people in. That is no longer the case. People will not have the patience.
If it's
I
on
was not
page
around in
one
the 80s, so I
and it's
cannot tell
that,
you what kind
yeah,
of patience people
yeah.
had in the 80s. I will tell you in 2023, which is when we are recording this, people do not have the patience to
Nope.
read a massive prologue about your world
Mm-mm.
without meeting the characters, without knowing why this is important, without having any story or action going on. They will not have the patience for it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, and again, I'm not sure if it's a modern audience or if it's just a problem of storytelling in general, but if you can show it, if your character can learn it, like in the course of the story, that is always going to be so much more effective for communicating the epic scale of this. And of course, that kind of stuff, if you are in an epic story and the world gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that is the perfect time to have side things like the Cimmerillion, like for people who want to engage deeper in the world.
Yeah.
Certainly all of that will come back into play if it doesn't like appear directly in your story. But that's why epic fantasy series usually are multiple books, right? Because we are journeying, we are seeing all of this, and it will all have its place. But don't do the dump. And like, especially with names, like that is something that drives me absolutely batty when it's like, all right, here is this guy, and you have to understand his 10 relatives like that came before him. And you're like, what? Or, oh, here's this woman, and she's talking to you about the 7 queens of the past like 20 years. And you're like, is this really exactly what we need to be doing right now?
Yeah. As Bonnie Juju says, put it on your website. That's what World Anvil's for.
Yep.
Share the lore with people who want
Have
to
a
read the
cast
lore.
list if you need it,
Yeah.
somewhere in
Dramatis
there.
Personae. Yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
But names just lose people. They fall out of the head. And especially if you're doing high fantasy names that have lots of syllables and are very strange, you're going to lose your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be very, very careful. As a general rule, if you want to, so this is the TLDR of my whole seminar on exposition, which is an hour long. The TLDR is if you want to deliver information to your audience, it should either be in motion, that is to say, somebody is discovering it through an action, or it should be emotional, that is to say, somebody is discovering it through an emotional experience.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's great.
In motion or emotional.
Fantastic. That's fantastic guidance.
I'll give you the hour seminar sometime, guys. But
Yes!
that's the TLDR. I have thought a lot about this. I'm gonna say something from a dyslexic's perspective, but I think this is something a lot of people struggle with. Names.
The names, yep.
Don't make all of your names the same or too similar. Nobody will know who is who. If there's Ashkanar and Anganar and Arganar and Ankganar, that's
and
these 4 people are
their
the same
cousin
to
from
me.
across the
I
mountains.
don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
Like, don't do that to me. I will cry, and then I'll throw your book across the room.
Or something I've seen too, if you have a character who has a first name, they have, their last name, and then they have a title, and then they have a bunch of nicknames, and you use them all interchangeably, and you expect people to track which character you're talking about. No, please don't.
Yeah.
Just please don't. Just pick the one name, stick with that. Or, if you establish they have a nickname, I'll use the nickname, 90% of the time.
Exactly. Strixline says, remembering a line from my favorite musical, it's a complicated Russian novel. Everyone's got 9 different names.
Yes, it's like
Yeah.
when you change tenses depending on who you're talking to in formality. In some cultures, you know, that works, and like, you know, it's a key part of identity. But if you are choosing to do it for no reason, maybe reconsider.
Yeah, absolutely. Or give some other kind of recognizer that
Yes,
is not based
help
on a
your
name.
readers. Help
Yeah,
your
like a physical
readers.
characteristic or something that will
Yeah.
help them. Oh man, names. Um, yeah, help guide your
Yeah.
readers and players is all I would say. As a player and a GM, I will say on both sides of the table, we struggle enough to remember the names of the NPCs.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say another one too, kind of, you know, drifting away from that a bit, is making your characters relatable. Because we
Yes.
want to see them succeed. We have to be with them for a long time as they grow and change. So it's really important that we can relate to them,
Absolutely.
that they don't make choices that are strange and we don't understand what's going on with them. Also, not to name names, but killing off beloved characters like loses a lot of trust. You have
Yeah.
to establish some kind of trust to your audience. Like if I'm
Yeah.
investing this much time in a character, make sure you don't like destroy them or ruin them, because we're also growing and changing and watching this character. We want them to succeed. So yes, you know, you put them in hard situations. Yes, they struggle, but there needs to be some level of confidence that the characters we are invested in are going to make it to the end, or if they don't, it's for a really good, really, really good reason.
Yeah.
There
That
has to be
it,
that trust. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And if you are going to kill someone off, that's what fatal flaws are for.
Yeah.
That's what tragic arcs are for. You know, these things need to be sculpted in a very
Yes.
clever way and signal to the reader if you're going to axe somebody that everybody loves. Like there should be a
Signal to the
really good
reader far ahead of time. And honestly, it should never be your main character.
killing off your main character is a fool's errand, guys. Don't do it. Don't do it.
In
Again,
this kind of story in particular, because
yeah,
it's all about that hero going from zero to hero, right? So we need them to
yeah,
be there for
exactly.
that journey.
Yeah. Katoy Boy says, avoid joke names for serious characters. Yes.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
another good one. Names set the tone for what you're trying to create. And in epic fantasy, there can be jokes, there can be levity, but there should be moments that are serious. And if your character is called, you know, Bobby Bingo,
Yeah.
and somebody's like, we meet again, Bobby Bingo, you will laugh.
Ah, Bobby
Everyone will
Bingo,
laugh.
the fate of the world relies on
Yeah.
your shoulders. If somebody says insert character name, the fate of the world lies on your shoulders, and it sounds silly, pick a
Yeah.
different name.
Yeah. Worm tongue, we're looking at you. Uh
We're like, he got killed out. It's fine. We all knew, you
fine.
know.
He had a very descriptive name. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh I guess here's one. So we've talked a lot about how epic fantasy is epic. It's big. It's about scale. One of the mistakes that people do make is not going epic enough. That
Yes.
it's small scale. They don't take on a big enough space, and yet they have all of these characters overreacting to stakes that are not high enough. They
Yep.
have, they're bringing in the king to deal with like some small thing to do with some local guy's sheep. This is not realistic for the world you are creating,
Yep.
and it's not going to give the impact that you are hoping it will give.
Yeah.
Make sure that you are dialing it up to 11 in terms of stakes and scale and size.
Yeah. This is especially important when you're thinking about the villains, because if we don't fear the villains, or this is a big common thing with these villains. They are like larger than life evil to the point we can't even understand them. They're like such an alien intelligence. Like this is why Sauron is an effective villain. We're like,
Yeah,
we don't know exactly everything, but this dude is so bad and we don't know exactly why, but that helps us fear him, right? So this whole sense, like, your villains have to be like that. If it's someone, it's a wayward noble who's mad about X, like that is just not going to be enough to deliver like that punch, that scale that we need.
yeah, exactly. And you need to build them up to be something that is is big, and there is a wonderful book behind me that I always recommend reading the first half of, because the second half is hugely problematic. The first half is really good. This is the 7 Basic Plots, and in it, Christopher Booker, the author, breaks down what is a monster. And one of the big fundamental things is they are in some ways similar to us, and in some ways incredibly alien, bestial. Something is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think you really need to dial that up to 11. That something is wrong with this. This is not a person operating on normal parameters anymore.
Your characters are very relatable. Your villains should not be.
Yeah, so your characters should feel very human, and that includes human flaws in a sensitive way, and all the human foibles that humans have, and human pets, and human loves, and favorite foods, and your villain should not feel that cuddly and realistic.
They're not hampered by any of that, right?
No, absolutely not. I'm going to say it, the thing that I've had up my sleeve since the beginning of this. If you are using military and you are using big military scenes, do not do what they did in the 8th season of Game of Thrones and put your military outside the fortress. Do not do that. Do not make level 1 military mistakes. If you're not confident in military tactics, go talk to somebody who knows more about this. Read a few books. Chat with some beta readers. You don't need to get it right all at once. You can start with insert battle or insert tactics or insert cunning plan and come back to it. But do the work, because seeing that in Game of Thrones season 8, that was more egregiously upsetting to me than anything else that happened in the whole of season 8, which was just a freaking fun.
Wow, that's a list. Yeah. It is when we are talking about epic fantasy, there's a reason this genre has captured the imagination and spurred on people to study military tactics. There are entire departments of universities dedicated to the history of warfare. And there are lots of great and very accessible resources for you to just get the basics. And honestly, that will just help you better understand how to tell these stories and how to, focus your camera, focus your lens as you're going on. So yeah, do the work. And also, world building work, engage in some World Anvil stuff, or, pick up some RPG systems like Tales of the Valiant that have this baked in from their foundation. Studying these things will do nothing but help you. Because I would say epic fantasy, perhaps more than other fantasy genres, does need a little more research. It does need a little bit more work, just because the scale is so huge in so many ways.
Yeah, exactly. Sun Tzu and the Art of War, super helpful for basic understanding of military tactics. Somebody else has said, play some Total War. It's actually very good. A lot of these big strategy mass combat style games can be really useful for
Age
this.
of Empires, great.
Absolutely.
Great game to play. Yeah. So Age of Mythology, another great game.
So many of these games out there. They are honestly, they're a great way to learn, because they have the whole thing is about this.
The mechanics are built around the historical mechanics,
Exactly. So if you want to learn, you can learn by reading, but you can also learn by playing games. And hey, that sounds really good to me. So obviously, with Tales of the Valiant, you set about building a role-playing game to tell epic fantasy stories. That's literally what it is.
Yes.
So how much of all of this stuff that we've been talking about today have you baked in to help GMs and players have this epic fantasy experience?
Oh, quite a bit, because we're working on basically 2 primary fronts here to translate this. One, on the mechanic side of things, making sure that this is built in here. So something we're doing, for example, we're moving, as a departure from 5th edition, we're moving all subclasses to be standardized at 3rd level. This is something we're doing to nail that feeling of power. That feeling of mastery. It already starts right in the mechanics from the beginning. If everybody is starting at this low point with their power, and then the way they unlock it, they do so as a group. They learn, they change, they grow as a group. That's totally right there in that feeling of epic fantasy. We are also, we're deciding to combine information from a PHB and a DMG into one book. So the player's guide is going to talk about how you create stories together, epic fantasy stories together on both sides of the table. So really empowering players and game masters to work together to nail this feeling of epic. Because if your players all understand what they're signing up for, this epic journey, they're going to have a better sense, like, knowing these big tenets, this is what we're in for. That's going to just make the storytelling more effective. It's empowering people around the table to get to that epic place and encouraging them to, like, you can be part of this. Look at these stories and understand that while we're starting here, we are going to go so far together. Really nailing that is just something again and again in every aspect of Tales of the Valiant we are returning to.
Do you have plans for guidance around things like mass combat that are, part of this epic fantasy style?
Well, I can't say specifically what's in the pipes. We are certainly looking beyond the core rules for those various aspects. Like, so combining theory with mechanics. So absolutely interested in very soon bringing people, like, really, how do you bring like nail a feeling of large scale combat? How do you bring that to the table? So while that might not live in the core rules, that is certainly going to be something we really want to give it its due and, like, bring times toward, like, as Tales of the Valiant, continues to exist and grow and more products are released for it.
I'm really, really excited about this for several reasons. If you, like me, have a library of 5 ebooks right now, this will be compatible with all of those.
Yes, it will.
Also comes without a setting, which means for world builders, it is a campaign setting maker's paradise.
Yes,
you can build whatever you want to support, like, and the rules will support it. And of course, Tales of the Valiant, all the Tales of the Valiant sheets are now on World Anvil. So if you're sitting there thinking this sounds really fun, you can go and build on World Anvil right now your own campaign setting, so you're all prepped. I am super excited about this. I know this sounds like something I was paid to say. I am not paid to say this. I'm just really excited about this because I think it's such a great, like, facelift for D&D 5e, which was, you can play any genre, you can do anything. No,
you can do anything. Any
epic
campaign,
fantasy.
No,
that's what this is about. This is about
epic. This is
epicness.
the heroic. This is Valiant.
Yeah, I am super excited about that. And again, you've heard Celeste is such an experienced like, fantasy savant. Like, she knows her stuff, and that's why I was so excited to have her on to talk about this topic as well. It's it's gonna be epic, guys. And I'm sorry, but I had to go there.
It's right there. Be bold, be brave, be valiant. Like, that's the call to action, right? Epic fantasy. Here it is, telling these stories together.
Okay, I have some audience questions, and they are really, really good. So let's get to this. Tillers asks a really important question for epic fantasy. How can you make epic fantasy feel epic for low-level characters? Getting wrecked by a bunch of kobolds sure doesn't feel epic.
Yes. So I think the big thing with this is to make sure they understand the point of these challenges, right? So just having random kobolds, like, wreck their day along the street. Also, thank you, kobolds. Kobolds are awesome. Just having them randomly wreck their day in a random encounter is not serving this feeling of story well. So I would say be very careful about the challenges you are throwing with them. And if you are going to be putting them up against a mechanical challenge that's, like, way above their punching power, make sure they understand that that is something related in the context of the story. And then make sure, even if they get, their butts handed to them, that they learn something valuable from the experience. So next time they have a tool, a piece of knowledge, a wound that scars over and allows them to better survive that same feeling next time. As long as you are good enough about doing that play, that exchange, and really giving them something that can help them survive at the end of this, that won't feel like a bad interaction. That can still be part of your epic storyline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're quite right. It has to have that feeling of scale. Yeah. But also, I will say that for a low-level character, there's, like, okay, one day you get wrecked by the kobolds, one day you wreck the kobolds, right? Or let's say goblins, because, we love kobolds here.
Yeah.
But when you do beat the goblins, that is a moment of, oh my god, we actually did it.
We did it this, like, we learned, we got better, we did it this time. So that's the feeling
Jem
forward.
the baker's son with a carving knife, and I took down 3 goblins.
Right.
The odds were stacked against me. I've never seen this thing before, but holy crap, I'm not dead yet.
Right. we see this in Game of Wheel of Time. Like at the very beginning, Trollocs come, destroy everything. Everybody, it's all so bad, and all the characters are, it's all bad. And they fail. They fail horribly. So this isn't an uncommon thing in epic fantasy. They always start by failing horribly, and then that forces them to have to be better. So as long as it's part of that, it's intentional, that's very much in line with epic fantasy.
Yeah, and that also shows the stakes. This is what happens when we don't stand up to the bad guys. And these are just the little bad guys, you know? What's going to happen when the real bad guys come
When
in?
you fight that, you know?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So it can be really illustrative, and it can be a victorious moment in its own right.
Yes.
We got
absolutely.
a great question here from Dark Elf Twilight, who asks, what defines epic fantasy as it is different from other kinds of fantasy specifically?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, we kind of touched on this, like dark fantasy, gritty fantasy, grim dark is usually different because the characters aren't necessarily heroic. Or so it's not so much about, they're more self-involved, I think, in the stakes, and like honestly, like survival, just surviving as a character is usually more important than surviving to save something large. So that's something there, and everything is morally gray. Like you're unsure who is the villain, you're unsure if you're the villain. Like that's the kind of like hallmarks of at least that one type of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, sword and sorcery has a lot in common with noir fiction, weirdly.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, it's one guy with his gun alone against the world,
Against
and the
world.
world is unfeeling. And honestly, the big difference with a lot of sword and sorcery is the people you're saving are also crappy.
Yeah. No one's
Often.
there's no clear right choice ever.
Yeah. And then with regard to things like urban fantasy, it's all about scale.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like urban fantasy is like, oh, the cabal of vampires will take over the city unless we stop them, or they'll enslave the neighborhood unless no. We're world stakes or bust. That's epic fantasy.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah. Or you
and
have
we
things
yeah, go
like
ahead.
high fantasy, which is like the characters already start with a ton of power. And you know, it's like more like Monster of the Week style. Like this book is about this monster we're smashing today. We have all the tools, but it might have some challenges here. And then next week we're gonna do it again.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're getting into sort of power fantasy, which is like, oh, the character's already powerful. It's only about the power. It's not about other things. So it really is its own distinct genre. But again, genres bleed into each other. As I said, dark epic fantasy is a subgenre
Yeah.
of epic fantasy. It's epic fantasy, but it's dark. Often the world is really crappy. You know, genre is a signpost. You
Yes.
know, it's a collection of things that you will probably see or you might see. And it's really useful to talk about because it sets up reader expectations and player expectations, and it's a shorthand for like a whole thing that we've been talking about now for an hour. But it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah.
And I fully encourage you to genre blend.
Yeah.
That would always be my takeaway.
Yeah. We're seeing so much these days, so many interesting stories being told in video games and shows, movies, books. Like play with it and do what makes sense for you
Yeah,
and your story.
absolutely. Dazzling Cat says, can you have an overarching umbrella epic plot over a series of smaller arc plots, say for a long-running novel series or 1 to 20 campaign, without revealing the epicness until further in?
Ooh, this would be, I think it depends on the scale you go for. I think yes is the answer totally, but I think if you are setting up those like hallmarks, you do need a central like core distant problem. Maybe you don't know exactly what the big evil behind the problem is, but if your big problem is, oh my god, the world is rotting, no matter what we do, everything is decaying, all of a sudden something has happened. And if you start by that first arc is, oh man, there's this like evil necromancer who is doing something, we clearly he is involved in this, right? And so the whole first arc is about stopping this necromancer. And then once you're there, you defeat the necromancer, you learn that he was actually working for, you know, this powerful goddess of death, right? Like as long as you can get the steps and you have a big overarching problem that everyone is very familiar with, because I think you do need that to spur the beginning of an epic story. But there are absolutely ways you can do this.
From a literary perspective, from a book perspective, one of the struggles is always you have to convey, particularly if you have a character who's outside the magical sphere at the beginning, which is
Yes.
very, very common, you have to convey that this is a magic book about magic things in the first chapter without giving everything away to your character. And that's sometimes why prologues can be used effectively, is to front end, look, this is a magic book, but now we're not doing magic, we're with everyday Joe, who's about to have a big surprise. And that is a completely legitimate way of doing it, but there has to be some kind of understanding that the journey we are about to embark on is this kind of journey. And if you do not like that kind of book, you're not going to enjoy this kind of journey. So get out now. And if you do like this kind of book, you are going to enjoy this kind of journey. So sit down, strap your seatbelts in, we're going for a ride. And it's really, if a book changes genre in the middle too much, it can give you genre whiplash, and you lose people who might have liked who like the first half but don't like the second half, or they might have liked the second half but they didn't get there because they had to get through the first half. So it's
Right.
a dangerous game to hide too much what
Hide too
you're
much,
trying
yeah.
to do. That's what I would always say there.
You
Unless
need
you
that
have,
strong call to action. The call to action needs to tie into the epic right
yeah,
from the
exactly.
get-go.
Exactly. And one thing that does this quite in quite an interesting way is, it's not my favorite fantasy book, but it is an interesting example of this, which is The Name of the Wind,
Oh,
which
yeah.
essentially has that epic setup where that this is clearly an epic story. We're dealing with, Captain Epic, who has retired and become a bartender, but is clearly very epic. We know he's a super epic hero. And then he has like all of these funny adventures. Like he goes off here and he goes off there, and he has like little serial adventures through
Yeah.
his life that don't seem very epic at all. But we know it's epic fantasy because we know where it's coming from,
Yeah.
and we've
We know
set up
we
who this
sense
guy
where it's
is.
going, right?
Exactly. So that is a way that you can do this, but you have to set up, this is the kind of fun we're going to be having, and the journey is a bit of a scenic route, but we'll get there. Stay with
Yeah.
me. And that's actually where that book lost me, is because there were too many, for
Yeah,
me
I was
personally,
actually,
to my
it's so
taste.
funny, that book series, I was like, "Is it epic? Is it not?" Right before this, I was thinking about it as a potentially an example, and I think I've landed on the side of not quite, there, because it deals too much with the mundane, I
Yeah.
think.
And the thing is, like, there are real epic moments that it sets itself up to be this epic thing, and then it has these like little serial stories going on, like little tiny like adventure of the week moments where for me it doesn't feel very epic. And I don't know, because until we get the third book, we won't know if this was all one part of a big adventure or what.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's how it was for me. As I said, these things are so personal. So if you love the book, then you love the book. If it's epic fantasy for you, then it's epic fantasy for you.
Heck
But
yeah.
I would say that's the perfect example of where somebody tried this and it almost worked.
Yeah.
And for some people who love the book, it super worked. For me, not quite. I think that is all we have time for. This has been an epic discussion, no pun
Yes!
intended. And Celeste, it has been so lovely having you here.
Oh, it's been so wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a joy to talk to you all. Um, Thank you. I love talking about fantasy, so I'm like, anytime, any place, let's get in here.
Well, we'll be doing more of these genre unpacking streams. So, folks, let me know what you would like to hear more about. Which genres are you curious about? And I'm going to go scour the internet for the best guests in the business, like Celeste here, and make sure that we have more episodes of unpacking genres, because I think they're really useful and really inspiring. At least this has been inspiring for me. You can find Tales of the Valiant over on Kickstarter. It is still live for a week or two, right, Celeste?
Yeah, a week or two. Let's see. Back the Kickstarter. I'm going there right now. 14 days ago, so exactly
14
2
days.
weeks.
2 weeks left.
We are almost at 900,000. So help us get to 1 million. Get in here and let's take this thing to the moon.
You guys have just blown through so many stretch goals already. I am
It
so
is
impressed.
so fun to be in the space where like, I need more stretch goals. Like that's such a good problem to have.
Oh
It's so
man.
wonderful to see.
I'm so excited for you all, and congratulations. And as I say, I'm so excited because I have all of these 5e books of various things, and I know I'll be able
You
to
can
use
use
them
them
within your
all.
system.
You don't have to get rid of anything. We don't want to invalidate anything. So we are working hard overtime, bending over backwards to make sure everything you have and every world you have will fit right in, be right at home in a Tales of the Valiant game.
I'm so excited about it. So, folks, we are live tomorrow at the same time this stream started with week 2 of our summer camp homework. Yeah, it's getting hot in here. We are getting ready for our July challenge, where we challenge you for 32 world building prompts. Whatever you can manage, there are stages along the way. And yeah, we're getting you all ready. Last week's theme reveal was the theme of power. We had a bunch of stuff. We had ECC books talking about it. This week we have Kitoipoi. We'll be revealing the new theme as well. We'll be setting you your new homework assignment if you are up for it. Getting yourself ready, getting your world ready, getting yourself inspired. Summer camp, it's a coming. And of course, on Sunday, Madeline will be going live with inspiring world intros featuring some members of our community. So if you're still figuring out how to introduce your world to others, make sure you tune in. It's going to be a whole bunch of awesome. Hey, could I put that in the chat? We are going on a raid, and our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. So shout it out when you get to the Lawhammer crew. Yeah, they're playing Fantasy Warhammer. Andy Law is the writer of Fantasy Warhammer, and he is playing live with his very best buddies. And he's also an Anvilite. Yeah, huge amounts of the Warhammer universe over on World Anvil. You can go check it all out, or why not just stick around and shout out Light Up the Forge to let him know that we sent you. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you all for your amazing comments. And all of you in the future, don't forget to rate our podcast, like our video, and all of those things that need to be done to help us keep making these kinds of content, these getting amazing guests like Celeste and all that jazz. Folks, you know what to do. Of course you know what to do. You got to grab your hammer and go world build. See you soon, guys. Bye.
Bye.